So perhaps, Dr. Weber, you could start us off. And in particular, if you could talk to us about how Switzerland can work within the EU while also dealing with the fact that it doesn't have to follow a lot of the EU rules.
Well, let me first endorse many of the things that have been said, and you saw that in the presentation of our chief economist. And let me also thank Judith for the recommendations that she put out here. I would like to start from the general proposition that we are a global bank. So is Credit Suisse. The two of us have many constituencies in which we engage regularly with supervisors, regulators, lawmakers, and the EU is one of them. You saw the map that was Swiss-centric, but even if you redraw that map and don't put Switzerland in the middle, Switzerland is the second largest trading partner of the EU, and it cuts both ways. It's also, in terms of financial markets, one of the financial markets that has actually two financial centers within the top 10. Given the importance of finance in Switzerland, and given the globality of the Swiss financial system, it is important for us to have market access and to engage with market participants around the globe. Starting in Australia when the sun rises, and actually up to our offices that close in San Francisco when the sun sets and in the evening. So we're 24 hours around the globe, a financial institution. You can bring global finance to the European Union and have global finance help Europe get through the current difficult situation. Because one thing that is clear is, and you can talk about several reasons why this is the case, European banks, which are the dominant source of funding, are still in a process of deleveraging. The European economy is an economy that has many problems at this point in time, and recovery, whilst it is positive to see that every European country now is back to positive growth numbers, recovery will be lackluster, it will be dragged out, and it will be slow. And it will probably be not sufficiently strong to reduce unemployment rates in Europe at a very, very strong pace. So Europe, at this point in time, in my view, can do with a helping hand from the outside, in addition to strengthening its own internal dynamics. Let me remind you that European recovery, and German recovery first and foremost, which is the economy I know best, has always been export-led recovery. When Europe recovers, foreign demand and interaction with foreign players is key. In finance, this is no different. I think European financial institutions will play a bigger role and a better role in financing growth and SMEs in the future. However, they're going through a deep adjustment process now, and in that process, other countries' financial centers, like ours in Switzerland, or the US and other constituencies around the globe, can help to reinvigorate growth in Europe by the availability of finance. And I was asked in the press conference this morning, is that not somewhat immodest that the foreign banks come to the EU and offer a helping hand? I don't think it is. Because if you look at capital ratios, if you look at liquidity ratios, if you look at the transformation of banking, Swiss and US banks are a step further ahead in that readjustment process than European banks. And Europe is just redrawing the map on banking regulation and banking supervision. The single supervisory mechanism is a big achievement. The ECB taken on the role as a single supervisor and as the authority which supervises at least the top 130 banks is a key achievement, rather than national legislation and national supervision, which has become kind of the second tier for smaller institutions. I envisage pretty much the same for the important project of capital market unions. Capital market unions can only be developed if you have capital market players engage with the European institutions in bringing capital markets forward. We are one of the biggest players in the global equity market. Therefore, having UBS and Credit Suisse engage with European capital market creation is an important thing to have. And I can tell you, when I travel the globe, and most of my travels actually do not lead me to Europe, they lead me to America, they lead me to Asia. When I talk to our investors, and we have a 2.5 trillion assets under management in the balance sheet. When I talk to our investors and ask them, which is the area where you have too low engagement, where do you have a underexposure, where would you like to have more exposure? They tell me, I'm currently short of exposures on the Eurozone, because until a few days ago, we discussed, potentially very devastating scenarios, and financial investors globally, therefore, have not put the money at work in the Eurozone. It's sitting idly on the sidelines. That money can be brought into the Eurozone to help reinvigorate European growth and capital market deepening at a point in time where European banks are impaired to play that role. Go back to what Yves Mersch said about the plane with the two engines. It's very clear capital market development in Europe needs to be done through capital market regulation and a program like Capital Market Union. We very much endorse that. And it needs action on all fronts. There is also a cyclical dimension which I'd like to point out. At the moment, equity markets are booming globally. Why? Because fixed income has negative yields up to 10 years. If you ask a global investor about investment strategies, they're being very difficult at the moment. If you're a pension fund or an insurance company, the negative rates of return over long periods of time make it very hard for you to gain a good return on fixed income investments, in particular for sovereigns, and it's very hard to guarantee insurance contract on defined benefit schemes that in this interest rate environment. So everyone's shifting to the equity markets. That's a train where there is some risk that this train will be missed in Europe because there isn't a big capital market to jump on. European equity markets are still fragmented. So we need to move on what was called the Giovannini barriers. And I think the one thing that I'd like to say on closing, it sounded nice when we heard about the time frame, 5 years to contemplate and then probably another 5 years to implement, 10 years. I don't think Europe should give itself 10 years to get a big push on capital market union. I think you need to front load that project. You need to really move on capital markets, because if European investors miss the train on capital market returns, and most European investors are not very equity oriented, they're not very capital market oriented, capital markets are too thin, that will be a very big problem, because 5 years from now, my prediction is banks will be back to a more normal situation. The sense of urgency about capital market union will go away to the degree that banks are back to normal. But let me remind you, capital market access in Europe is always through banks. Banks have to play a vital role in developing capital markets, and international banks, which are having the expertise because they have developed capital markets in their home countries, can lend a hand to developing dynamic capital markets in Europe. So this is all about finding new rules within the EU, and I very much welcome that. But don't forget, there's the external dimension. Reach out to global financial markets, to capital markets, to the US, to Switzerland, to other major players, and involve them in the process, because that will help speed up the process. It will help you avoid mistakes that otherwise you might do, because the international expertise on capital markets is really very, very dominant outside the EU, because that's where those markets are, and that's where those international institutions that we represent here, Credit Suisse and UBS and many other international banks, are willing to cooperate with the EU in this project.